Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 13th of November. Today we have some updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the LPR, with Kupiansk and Liman frontline. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area, and as you can see, there are all these icons are concentrated at the same place. We see that Ukrainians were developing and were trying to attack the Russians in direction of Vladimirovka, in direction of Novosilovska, and in direction of Stelmakhovka. Or to be more precise, there is another town by the name of Smievka. The Russians reported that they managed to repulse all those attacks, that they forced Ukrainians to step back and so on, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukraine lost around 110 soldiers and something around 12 armored vehicles. So this is the front line, and according to this map, Volodymyrovka, as you can see, still considered as a territory under Russian control. Novosilovska, this area where the clashes are. And if we're talking about Stelmakhovka, according to the Western sources map, this town is under Ukrainian control. As you can see, we might say that the Ukrainians are already fighting in the area between two rivers, on the bridgehead between these two rivers. The Ukrainians are using the same tactic as the Russians are using in town like Bakhmut or in town like Avdiivka, when they're trying to storm these areas in front, because there are no other option how to encircle this area or to attack the enemy in their flank and so on. As you can see, the Ukrainians had a lot of losses. We have some video confirmation and so on, but anyway, no matter the losses, no matter anything, we see that Ukrainians step by step, meter by meter, but they're pushing the Russians back, and they're forcing them to step back on the Red River, on the line of this river, because both maps confirm this information. You see that there is a green line and there is a gray line, shows that there is this area is in the gray zone, and there are very heavy clashes there, and the Ukrainians are pushing. Another important update are coming from Makeevka, this one. This town is in the gray zone, and during the previous months we heard a lot of updates that first the Ukrainians took control of this town, the next day the Russians pushed the Ukrainians back and so on. This town, Makeevka, is located in the lowlands, so it's very difficult to defend this town, and both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, are able to control their enemy in this town and to attack enemy with artillery and something like this. Today, according to the report of Ministry of Defense, we heard that the Russians repulsed all the Ukrainians' attacks that were in direction of this town, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 70 soldiers, something around 6 armored vehicles. Furthermore, the Ukrainians were attacking the same towns like Chervona Popovka, this one, and Stelmakhovka. So all those attacks were repulsed, but the Russian source map has been updated, as you can see. And today we got a lot of information, updates from the Russians who is on the ground, and they're saying that this town is not under Ukrainian control, but this town is not under Russian control as well. This town is in the gray zone, and there is like heavy clashes of commando scouts in this area, and they're just pushing each other every day. This town changed its flag. And that's it about this front line. As you can see, the Ukrainians are pushing, and we see almost the same situation as we saw in Kherson district on our famous bridgehead, this on David Brode, Bilogorka, Andreev Klazov bridgehead, when the Ukrainians made every single day another attempt of attack in direction of Russian forces, and according to the Russians report, they every single day the Ukrainians lost dozens and hundreds of soldiers, but at the end of everything the Russians were forced to leave Kherson bridgehead. So the same situation we can see here. We don't have any updates from the Western sources about the losses, about the progress, just the fact that the Ukrainians were attacking. But the same picture, the same situation, so we'll need to wait a little bit, and I believe, of course, there are a lot of differences between these two bridgeheads. First of all, if we're talking about the north of LPR, there are no problems with supply and support. This area has a very big border with Russian Federation. There are a lot of roads, and there are a lot of the back is very strong in this area, and the Russians don't have problem. There is a battle of the tactic and of the heads of commanders. If we were talking about Kherson, we saw in this area the battle of logistic, and the Russians lost this battle. They haven't lost their soldiers, their forces, but they lost logistic battle, and they were forced to leave this area because they understood if they would stay there, they would lost the entire army. And we know that as a result of evacuation operation, the Russians managed to move from this bank of the river around 20 or maybe 30,000 soldiers. That's a lot, and it might be like a disaster for the Russians if they lost such a big army. So the same situation is here, but the problem is that the Russians don't have problem with supply and support. But if we're talking about the Ukrainians, we can say that they do have problems with supply and support, because we can say that this is the opposite situation to the Kherson district. Let's say there is Oskol River, it's like Dnieper River, there is Seversky Donetsk River, there are no bridges in this area, and if we're talking about, let's say, Kherson, we can say that the Russians did have possibilities to use Antonov Bridge, the biggest bridge, at least for some vehicles and cars to cross this bridge. But if we're talking about the Ukrainian bridgehead, there are no bridges in this area, just pontoon bridges or some engineering constructions that Ukrainians built during the offensive operation. So of course they are stable. The Ukrainians have possibility to build such bridges as much as possible, as much as they need. But anyway, I believe that it's not a very big problem for the Russians if they want to shut down any of this bridge, because you can see the distance between the Russians' positions and the river like Seversky Donetsk or Oskol is less than 50 kilometers, 40-30 kilometers. The only thing they need is just to spot their enemy to destroy the bridge. Maybe it's a question of the price. What is more expensive? To build the bridge or to destroy this bridge with, let's say, drone or with artillery or rockets or something like this. But anyway, even if the Russians know about the bridges or pontoon bridges from the Ukrainian side on Oskol and Seversky Donetsk River, they are not destroying them, and they allow the Ukrainians to move a lot of forces on this bridgehead, and they allow them to attack. Maybe at some point of time they will, maybe at rush hour or something like this, they will destroy the bridges and they will try and destroy the Ukrainian army in this area. But for now, there are no changes. Now we are moving to the south, to Seversk-Bakhmut front line. The Western source map hasn't been updated. There is no update. There are no updates in this area at all. But there are some updates from the Russian source. First of all, the Russians have entered this North Bilogorovka as well, and they're pushing the Ukrainians back. There is one important update. As you can see, the Western source map has been updated, and now they shows that this forest that located in the south from Kremenaya, this one, is under Russian control. And we can say that this is some kind of fact, because the Russians are strong Bilogorovka, and they're pushing Ukrainians to step back in direction of Grigorievka and Serebryanka, and the Russians tries to short the front line and to establish more reliable position on the west from Kremenaya, and to be on the safe side on the south on Seversky Donetsk River, on the bridgehead on Zarechno, Ternovo, Yampolovka bridgehead. Another important update are coming from this Bilogorovka. The Russians report that they control at least a half of this town, and the situation on this front line is something like this. According to the Russian sources, they control entire Berestov and Nagorno, half of Bilogorovka. Now, the Russians are trying to encircle Yakovlevka, and now they're trying to attack this town in two directions, trying to encircle, but without any progress and success. All attacks were repulsed. Bakhmutska, there are still questions about this town, because the Russians reported that they established entire control over this town, and that they control this T-1302 road. And this picture according to the Russian sources, but according to Western sources, we don't have this. We don't see these updates. Just the only confirmation that, to believe the Russian words. Maybe it's true, but for now there are no updates from this area. If we are talking about Bakhmut, as you can see, situation is critical. We can split this like a smaller circle, and we can say that, let's say 60%, not 60, 30, like 25 to 30, 40% of the border of this town is already under Russian control. Furthermore, as you can see, the Western source map has been updated. Now they're showing us the progress near a small town by the name of Mayorska, this station. According to the Russian sources, if we take a look at this area, you're gonna see that there is an icon showing that the Russians established control entire of the station, and now they're pushing the Ukrainians on the south, trying to develop their bridgehead in direction of Azaryanovka, Kurdyumovka, Klishchevka. So they want to continue doing what they're doing, and of course the main goal, the Russians are planning not to attack Bakhmut, but first of all to attack small towns around Bakhmut like Klishchevka, like Andreevka, like Kurdyumovka, like Azaryanovka. These towns, I'm not sure that the Russians are able to get control or to enter Toretsk and New York agglomeration. I believe they will try to go a little bit to the north by taking this bridgehead, and of course the main goal in these areas we discussed, they want to encircle this town, to establish control, to prepare such a bridgehead in this area, and of course after that they will try to develop their offensive operation to the north in direction of Chasov Yar and to cut this road. Of course they will try to take all these small towns around this area. It will be like far checkpoints, like to pin down the Ukrainians and so on. And in this situation, the situation with Ukrainians in Bakhmut will be very difficult, and I believe that in this case they will be forced to prepare, or at least to have plan B for evacuation. Now let's move to the south, to Donetsk. There are no changes. The only change, according to the map, we see the Russian source map has been updated, and now they shows that Opytne is under their control. If we take a look at the Western source map, for now we don't have such an update. We see that both these two towns, like Opytne and Vodyane, are still on the Ukrainians, these two towns. According to the Russians, they have already showed the picture. If we take a look at the deployment map, they shows that these towns is under Russian control. See, at least half of Vodyane, the east part of Vodyane and the west part of Opytne is under Russian control, and the deployment map says that the Russians provided just a photo and video confirmation that they control just these two parts of this town, but the Russians says that they control entire Opytne and controls entire Vodyane. If we're talking about Opytne, we need to understand that there are not many roads that Ukrainians do have, and to be more precise, the Russians are saying that there are no more roads that Ukrainians have in this area to supply and support these towns. So I believe that this is the real picture, and that Ukrainians left these towns and the Russians are moving to the west, trying to complete the clearing of Vodyane. What the Russians are planning to do in this area, we understand, we discussed this many times. They want to complete Vodyane operation, Pervomayska clearing, Nivolskaya, and to get Nitailova. So this triangle is the triangle that the Russians are planning to get control over in the next months. I believe that of course they need to hurry up, and believe that they would like to complete this mission at least by the end of January, and after that in parallel mode they will try to develop their offensive operation to the north in direction of Severna Tonnenka, and this is going to be like the battle for Avdiivka. But for now we see what we have what we see. Now we're moving to the Pavlovka front line. The Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 60 soldiers, something around 6 armored vehicles in this area. They're waiting for reinforcement from the Kherson district. They made a few attempts of counter-offensive operation trying to pin down the Russians in Mykolaiv and Pavlovka. According to the results we have from the report of Ministry of Defense, those attempts were repulsed by the Russians, and the Western sources haven't provided any evidence that Ukrainians managed to get control over some part of these towns or something like this. So it was some kind of waste attack, or maybe the main goal of those attacks were to stop or pin down the Russians. Maybe they achieved some success, but anyway, more and more sources are saying that the Russians are planning to continue their offensive operation in direction of Ugledar, and that they will try to get control over these towns the next weeks, or maybe the next week, or maybe the next month, or something like this. So the Russians are planning to continue. And if we take a look at the map of disposition of deployment map, we're gonna see that that this area is under defense of 72nd Mechanized Brigade. These are famous 72nd Brigade that were like they used to be on the south of Bakhmut, and while they were there in the south of Bakhmut, if you remember, 72nd Mechanized were deployed in Kadema, Semigorye, Nikolaevka, Druga, this area. But after Zaitsevo, Vesela Dolina, this area was under defense of 72nd Mechanized Brigade. But Wagner's, as I believe that they made a lot of damage to this brigade, and the Ukrainians were forced to move this brigade to the south for some kind of, let's say, I don't know, to redeploy this brigade, to fulfill this brigade, and so on. And after that, the entire south of Bakhmut has been collapsed without this brigade. And now this brigade is located on the south, on the most important, I believe, area, because 72nd Brigade is very cool brigade. They're powerful forces. They're the veterans of this war, and they know what they're doing. So now they're trying to stop the Russians near Ugledar. And if we're talking about Ugledar, about the Russians, there is 155th Marine Brigade, there is 40th Marines Brigade, there is 11th Motorized Regiment Vostok. So these are Russian regular forces. If we are talking about the Bakhmut, we know that the Bakhmut is stormed by the private PMC Wagner, and with some support from LPR forces, DPR forces, so those guys who was there in 2014, and they're there right now. But if we are talking the Ugledar, now there are heavy clashes between Ukrainian regular armies and the Russians regular army. So very interesting, and of course the Russians want to show themselves in this area to be more precise. And if I remember, to tell the truth, this idea came to my mind right now. If we are talking about the entire conflict, yes, the Russians show themselves at the beginning of the special operation Gostomel, Chernigov, and the entering the north of Kiev, all those operations at the beginning. All this developing of the bridgehead was done by the Russians regular forces. But after that, I haven't heard about any victory of the real Russian army on the ground. We remember that if you're talking about Popasna was taken by Wagner forces. If we're talking about Bakhmut is stormed by Wagner forces. If we're talking about Lysychansk, Severodonetsk agglomeration, these towns were stormed by Chechensky Spetsnaz Akhmat. Yes, I remember that the Russians, the regular Russian army, got control over Toshkovka. Over this Toshkovka, if you remember, after that, the entire south area from oil refinery has been collapsed, and that was the key to the Lysychansk agglomeration area. But anyway, I haven't heard about the real victories from the Russian real army. Yes, now they're doing well. 20th Army are doing well, like on the Kupiansk front line. They're trying to stop the Ukrainians' offensive operation on the bridgehead that doesn't have any bridges that connects with the mainland, and without any supply and support or real supply support, the Ukrainians are still very successful. So I believe that it's time, if you're talking about Ugledar, this is time for the Russians to show their army and to show the real victory in this area. And we know that the Russians were defending Kherson bridgehead, but now, yes, maybe they were pretty successful, and they were pretty successful for a very long time. But if we're talking about the results, we see the result that the Russians are no longer controls this bridgehead. And now let's talk a little bit about another situation. During the previous months, we discussed a lot of clashes in Kherson. Now everybody understands that there are going to be no clashes on the Dnipro River. Maybe the Ukrainians will try to make some crossing operation of this river on the boats, trying to storm the Russian position at this bank of the river. But I'm not sure that this is going to be some kind of real offensive operation where the Ukrainians will try to develop something on the boats. It's highly unlikely. We discussed this bridgehead for many times. We discussed a lot the bridgehead between Vremevka, this one, Velika Novoselovka, to Marinka, this front line. And if we're talking about the previous months, Ugledar battle is one of the most important battles, I believe, in this campaign. It's the key to the south, to the, let's say, Kurakhova area, to the Kurakhova bridgehead. If the Ukrainian loses Ugledar, they may lose entire bridgehead. So, and we saw a lot of clashes. The Russians were storming Novomikhailivka. There are a lot of clashes there. The battle for Ugledar, very strong battle. There were clashes around Velika Novoselovka. So we had a lot of updates from this area. During the previous months, almost every single day we discussed the Pesky bridgehead and Avdiivka bridgehead. So there are a lot of very clashes, a lot of heavy clashes. The Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians from this bridgehead, trying to push the artilleries from Donetsk, trying to encircle Avdiivka and so on. We haven't heard, I mean, they haven't received a lot of much updates from New York agglomeration. So this is, let's just keep this area in our minds, that the area Toretsk, New York, is the area that haven't suffered a lot from the clashes on the ground. Yes, there is artillery duels and so on, but no clashes in this area. So I believe that because of the fact that this area is heavy fortified, there are a lot of fortification, a lot of landfills in this area, so it's very difficult to storm this area in the front just to encircle. But let's just keep this area in our mind. The area between Mayorsk, let's say Bakhmut-Seversk, a lot of clashes almost every single day. We discussed about the plans, about the Russians, what are they doing, what the Ukrainians are doing. The same situation in Liman-Kupiansk front line and so on. So as you can see, there are two places in Ukraine where we have on the active front line. I'm not talking about, let's say, the Kharkiv area or the rest of Ukraine. I'm talking about the line of battle, this battle line, right? There are two places we haven't received any updates like for now. The first one is New York Toretsk agglomeration, this one, and we understand why is that. There are a lot of fortifications and there are a lot of landfills, as this one, this landfill, this, and it's very easy to control the Russians, and it's very difficult to storm this area in the front. It's even worse than Avdiivka. The only difference between Avdiivka and Toretsk is that in front of Toretsk is Gorlovka. It's a big town. I believe that a few 100,000, maybe 100,000 are there. But anyway, it's not Donetsk. And if we are talking, and the second place we haven't received much updates is this front line. The front line between Kamyanska to Velika Novoselovka. This front line. And today in this part of this video, I would like to discuss with you this situation. The Russians, when they started their, let's look at the Western Sources map, let's move to this map. The Russians, when they announced about their evacuation process, they told us that the head of this special operation told us that the Russians were planning to move this area to other front lines with one purpose: to start offensive operation, to help with offensive operation and so on. And of course, one of the places where the Russians might move these forces is Ugledar or anywhere else or something like this. But you know, sometimes I have like maybe third feeling or something like this, and today something tells me, like my feeling is telling me, when I was looking at this map, I understood that something is going to happen these days, even before the end of the year, between Orekhov and Gulyai-Polye. You know that we understand, and this war show us, this conflict show us that, first of all, this is not the war of the ground, like during the Second World War, when the countries were trying to take as much as possible and so on. First of all, we saw that this is the war of technologies, like, yes, this is the war of artillery, yes, and this is the war technologies, artilleries, and destroying of enemy manpower. So it's not the main goal to take the ground, but it's very important to destroy the enemy manpower. And the fourth thing is that this war is the war of media war. And today is 13th of November, and we need to understand, we are regular people. And believe me that Zelensky, Putin, all these guys, they're also, yes, they're taking a very high position, but from like regular perspective, they're regular people. They can be sick, they have friends, they can be in love and so on. They're regular people. And we see that it's the new year is in 2 months. And believe me, as anybody regular person, when we have our regular life, everybody wants to complete some things before the new year. So it's like some kind of tradition to do something before the new year and to start the upcoming new year with a very good news. So for example, if we have some debts, we try to pay the debts before the new year because we want the new year to start without any debts. If we are reading the book, we want to complete the book by the end of this year, just to start the new year with the new book or something like this. If we have some deal, if we're trying to construct something, we try to achieve as much progress as possible before the new year to start the new year with greatest update, new updates, and so on. So believe me, both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, they want to achieve December victory. And December victory is going to be the most important victory during this year. Because at the beginning of this conflict, we saw that the Russians had a lot of victories. They got control, then they stepped back. In November, September, August, the Ukrainians had a lot of success. They returned Kharkiv, they returned Kherson, they returned a lot of things they could return and so on. But 1 month left. 1 month left. December, half of November and December, months and a half. Believe me, they will try to complete this year with significant victory. This is very important. This is very important for both of them. It's very important that in the New York Eve on the 11 p.m. or 11 p.m. and 50 minutes to show open TV, to show the president of Putin or Zelensky, and with their speech before the civilians, where they're saying that by the end of this year we achieved success, and no matter we lost here, let's say Putin, Kherson, and so on, we achieved a great success. So this is the thing that both parties will try to achieve by the end of this year. Believe me, and they will try. And now they're preparing the plans. So the Russians reported that they will move their forces from Kherson district, and I believe that the Russians moved them here to Orekhov-Gulyai-Polye front line, to this area. Let's analyze this. We analyze this area from the Russian side, and believe me, the Russians do have a very nice position in this area. They have a fortification Vasilievka, they have fortification Tokmak, they have this railroad cross fortification, they have Pologi and so on, they have Bilimak, they have Rozovka, so they do have a lot of forces. All these areas tightly connected with the railroad and so on. But let's take a look at the Ukrainians. If we are talking about the Ukrainians, their situation is much worse in this area. They have Orekhov fortification. Yes, we know this fortification. Not a very big town with the railroad, with stable support from the mainland and so on. The second fortification is Zalichne Gulyai-Polye. This is the second Ukrainian fortification, very powerful base as well. Again, a railroad connection, roads, a lot of roads and so on. And the third one, fortification, is Velika Novoselovka, this one. And we know that there are very heavy clashes at the Vremivka tactical bridgehead in this area. By the way, there are changes with the differences with this Russian sources map. According to this map, the Ukrainians control Niskuchne and Vremivka, and according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians control just Vremivka. Furthermore, this Vremivka is in the gray zone, and during the previous months, there were updates that the Russians reported this town was taken by the Russians. So let's go back to this area. So the Russians moved their forces, I believe, to this area. We haven't received updates, and to tell the truth, there are artillery duels in this area, we understand this, but the most important thing that forces in this area, and I'm talking about the Ukrainians, they are relaxed. The forces that located there, let's take a look at the deployment map. This is our deployment map, and if we take a look at this area, we're gonna see that there are a lot of artillery systems, like 43rd Artillery Brigade, 45th Artillery Brigade. There are 110th Defense Brigade. It's just territorial forces, like regular people. 110th Defense Brigade, and there is just 165th Mechanized Brigade, some kind of operational regiment, National Guard. Also, there is National Guard, again, Public Protection Brigade. So as you can see, from perspective of forces, there are not much forces there. And I believe that this is the weakest Ukrainian position all along the front line. And believe me, the Russians know the same situation as well. It's not just the military summary who knows this. Everybody understands that this is the weakest position on the front line. There are a lot of forces in Kherson. There are still a lot of forces, and the Ukrainians haven't completed deployment process. Furthermore, to redeploy these forces, they need to use the bridges that goes through Zaporozhye and through Dnieper. And this is not an easy job. And the Russians, maybe they expect when the Ukrainians will start a redeployment process to... So Ukrainians, while redeploying, they're very, very careful. They're redeploy their forces very slowly, trying to hide the equipment, and of course it will take a lot of time while the Ukrainians will be able to redeploy their forces. Also, there are a lot of forces on this front line, like Kharkiv, LPR, and this is the weakest position from any perspective. And if we're talking about the Russians, I can't say that this area is the weakest from the Russian side. They redeployed their forces, not very far to go. There is no bridges. They just moved their forces. I believe it will take maybe 2 days to redeploy all 20-30,000 army in this area. But what the Russians can do next? If we take a look at this area, we're gonna see that there is few weak points in Ukrainian defense orders. And the weakest points is that there is a very big distance between fortifications. Guliai-Polye, Orekhov, the distance between these two fortifications is around 30 kilometers. Guliai-Polye, Velika Novoselovka, 45 kilometers. So what the Russians can do in this situation? Of course, the most obvious and the most obvious attack in the end of November, when we are going to see the temperature below zero and the ground will be freezed and the Russians will be able to use their tanks, is to attack, first attack is to attack between Guliai-Polye, Velika Novoselovka fortifications in this area. This is the first penetrating attack with one purpose, to get as deep as possible in the Ukrainian defense orders. The second attack, we can say that the Russians are able to do between these two rivers. Like these two attacks between fortifications, the distance between them allows the Russians to do this. I don't believe that Ukrainians do have very nice positions. Even if they have this village like of one street, it's highly unlikely that it's possible to hold this position under big pressure by the Russians. And of course, if the Russians do these two attacks, then they are able to let's say to connect their forces in this area and to encircle Guliai-Polye fortification. Now the Russians are storming Ugledar, and I believe that as soon as the Russians get control over Ugledar, so this is like the start operation of this global offensive operation. If the Russians are able to get control over Ugledar the next weeks, and they will try to do this, then they will be able to develop their offensive operation, like global attack in this area as well, and to try to encircle Velika Novoselovka as well with such attack. I'm not saying that the Russians will be able to connect their forces, but anyway, they will try to create operational or maybe tactical operational encirclement of these three fortifications: Velika Novoselovka, Guliai-Polye, and Orekhov. And of course, from this area, the Russians are able to do the same in direction of Kamyshovaha, and with help of this, to try to somehow to encircle the Ukrainians. Orekhov, Guliai-Polye. So I believe that the Russians will try to push the Ukrainians as much as possible from these positions to the north, with one purpose: to cut supply road that connects Zaporozhye and let's say south of Donetsk region. Furthermore, by this attack, the Russians will be able to create some kind of operational encirclement of Zaporozhye and to create a partial blockade of this town. The Ukrainians will still have a possibility to support this town by the river, but as you can see, there are just few bridges. And if the Ukrainians destroyed Antonov Bridge, believe me, the Russians had more possibilities to do this, because they have better weapons for these purposes, not just HIMARS. And by this development, at least for me, if we're talking about possible areas to attack, I believe that the Russians, this is the only place where the Russians can do something, because it's the weakest position, and it will take time from Ukrainians to deploy forces there and to stop the Russians. Furthermore, don't forget that during these previous 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks, the Russians haven't attacked Ukraine with Kalibr, Iskander, with drones as heavy as they used to, as they did this before. What does it mean? That means that or there is a process, some kind of negotiation process that we talk about, or maybe the Russians are collecting their rocket, missile, drone forces for one massive attack at some certain time when it's needed. So believe me, if the Russians are able to, I don't know, to shut down this area with the rockets, with these bridges, believe me, there are no defense in any Ukraine that are able to hold such attack. And if we're talking about this area, the weakest position, there are no such forces that are able to stop the Russians in this area. So we'll see, of course we'll see, but anyway, if the Russians want to do something like this, they will try to do this by the end of this year. They will try to do this as soon as they start storming of Ugledar, as soon as they will be ready to do this. I'm not saying that they will take first Ugledar and after that they will develop this operation. No, I believe that they will do this at the same time. They will attack like 1, 2, 3, 4 directions between fortification, trying to pass from the sides of this fortification, and then they will try to encircle them. And it will be like a disaster for the Ukrainians, because as a result of such an operation, if the Russians are able to do this, there are a lot of problems with this. We see a lot of rivers, a lot of barriers be in front of Russians. But for the other side, there are a lot of places where they can cross these fields if the ground has been freezed by the temperature. So I believe that in 2 weeks, or the Russians will start doing this, or maybe they will try to do something else on the somewhere else front line. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like on my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.